Researchers at Harvard studied thousands of employee workdays while researching motivation. What they discovered was that the single biggest driver of motivation wasn't money, it wasn't status, it was making meaningful progress that someone acknowledged. Even small recognition of effort significantly improved motivation and emotional well-being. There's even neuroscience research showing that social rejection or disregard activates the same brain regions involved in physical pain. So when someone's effort goes unseen, the nervous system registers that, not emotionally, biologically, physically, which means when effort is invisible, the brain only registers the cost of that effort, not the reward. This is Hustle Rebels, a podcast for people who know how to grind, but are starting to question the cost. I'm Renee, and here we talk about success, burnout, and nervous system regulation without glorifying exhaustion or sacrificing your health, relationships, or your sense of self, and without pretending ambition is the problem. Let's get into it. Welcome back to Hustle Rebels. Real quick, before we jump into the episode, if you're someone who's been feeling like you're running on autopilot lately, or like the stress you're carrying is deeper than what's showing on the surface, I break these ideas down much more in my Burn the Blueprint Masterclass. In that training, I walk through how high-achieving people end up stuck in survival mode, how to start questioning the beliefs, conditionings, and identities that might be limiting your potential, and how to rebuild a true identity that actually aligns with who you are now. If you want to check that out, the link is in the show notes. And if you're new here, make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss any future episodes. I truly love having you guys here. And I've been having a really fun time making these. So, today's episode is actually setting the stage for a conversation I'm having next week with my guest, Steve Basson. A little bit about Steve real quick before next week. He's a licensed mental health counselor, the owner of Straight to the Point Therapy, and he does get straight to the point. He's also the host of a podcast called Resilience Development in Action, which you can check out before his interview next week, where he focuses heavily on mental health in high-pressure professions like first responders, leadership roles, and other environments where burnout often becomes normalized. One of the things Steve talks about a lot is something he calls invisible injury, the psychological wear and tear that deserves the same level of respect as a physical injury. But before we get into that conversation next week, I want to take today's episode to go a little deeper into the science behind something that affects almost all of us. So we're going to get a little nerdy today, so stick with me. We're going to talk about invisibility, not in a superhero sense, the kind of invisibility that shows up in everyday life. When the effort that you're putting in feels unseen, and the stress you're carrying is invisible to everyone around you. Because here's something interesting. Most people say they don't need recognition. I am one of them. I grew up in a culture where you weren't really supposed to have recognition. We say things like, I'm not doing it for the praise. Give God all of the glory. I don't need a pat on the back. I just do my job. I did kind of throw in that little religious one there because that's the environment that I honestly grew up in. But neuroscience actually tells us something different. Humans are wired to want their effort to be seen. And when effort stays invisible for too long, something else becomes invisible too, the injury. So by the end of this episode, you're going to understand how the brain is constantly scanning and processing information through systems like the Reticular Activating System, why emotional processing often gets postponed just so that we can function on a daily basis, and how invisible effort combined with invisible stress can quietly lead to overwhelm and burnout long before we even realize what's happening. Because the reality is, your brain has been working behind the scenes this entire time, constantly scanning, constantly filtering, constantly processing more than you're even aware of. And while that system is what allows us to function day to day, it also means that a lot of what we carry never gets fully processed in the moment, and it's designed to do that. But we're going to break this down. So I mentioned that your brain is constantly scanning your environment. Every moment of the day, it is picking up information. Conversations, stress, body language, tone, deadlines, expectations, all of it. And most of that information never reaches your conscious awareness. This is because of something called the Reticular Activating System, or your RAS. So the Reticular Activating System acts like a filter between the world and your conscious mind. It decides what gets your attention and what gets pushed into the background. And it honestly affects us in a lot of ways, but we're going to use it for this one today. Because if your brain tried to consciously process every single input that came your way all day long, you truly wouldn't be able to function. You would be paralyzed by analysis. It's like the ADHD brain, analysis by paralysis, paralysis by analysis, something like that. So the brain does something brilliant. It prioritizes action over reflection. It postpones processing. This is especially obvious in high-pressure environments. There's actually a documentary where a film crew rode along with paramedics responding to a severe accident. The filmmaker later talked about how emotionally wrecked he was specifically by the scene. There were destroyed vehicles, there was a lot of blood, and there was even a child screaming for their mother. The filmmaker said he couldn't stop thinking about it. If I remember correctly, I think he even threw up on scene. While the paramedic who was working on the call appeared to be very, very calm, focused, procedural, unfazed. But the paramedic wasn't unaffected entirely. Their brain had simply pushed the emotional processing aside so that they can function in the moment. Because when the brain switches into operational mode, the sympathetic nervous system is driven and it activates. Focus narrows, emotions quiet down, decision-making speeds up. This is your fight or flight. And the brain says, we'll deal with the feelings later. Right now, we have to do work. That's how humans survive stressful situations. But here's the catch. Later doesn't always come. Now, obviously, I know most people listening to this aren't responding to car accidents for a living. I get that. Your version of operational mode probably doesn't involve ambulances and wrecked vehicles or burning buildings. But your brain doesn't actually require something that dramatic to do the exact same thing. It doesn't know the difference between a Karen on the road that's pissing you off or survival mode being chased by a bear. It happens in everyday life all of the time. Your brain still flips into the same, not now, deal with it later mode. So on a smaller scale, I can break it down as simply as possible. It could look something like this. Your boss sends an email that immediately stresses you out, but you're in the middle of 10 other things. So your brain says, not now, push that feeling aside, later. You have an uncomfortable conversation with someone. Maybe it's in a relationship, maybe it's a parent, a child, a boss, an employee. Your chest tightens a little bit, but you've got somewhere to be. So your brain says, not now, later. You're juggling work, family responsibilities, financial deadlines, expectations. You feel pressure building. You still have to function in your daily activities. So again, the brain just says not now, later. Honestly, this happens every single time I open up my LinkedIn emails, so I apologize in advance to anyone that's out there listening to this, and I sent you a message in January and have yet to respond. I feel like LinkedIn messages never stop, but side note, I am grateful for every single one of you. I will get to you eventually. But each time that happens, nothing looks dramatic on the outside. You still show up, you still perform, you get things done. But internally, the brain is quietly stacking those postponed stress responses, one after another. And eventually, the brain has to deal with all of it, which brings us to something called allostatic load. Neuroscientist Bruce McEwen coined a term called allostatic load. Allostatic load describes the wear and tear on the body from chronic stress. Not a single traumatic moment, but the accumulation of postponed stress responses. So that's every time the brain says, not now, I'll deal with it later. It's essentially putting another item on a psychological backlog. So it's basically a tab that will eventually have to be paid. The problem is, most modern environments never give us space to close that tab. Work pressure, deadlines, emails, family responsibilities, expectations. So the brain just keeps pushing these things down the road. And eventually, the road runs out. That's when people start saying things like, I don't know why I feel so overwhelmed. I'm exhausted, but nothing specific happened. I just feel done. That's the invisible injury. And this is what we're going to dive deeper into next week with Steve, and why it's so important to treat it with just as much respect as a visible injury, like a broken arm or surgery. So make sure you're subscribed because you're not going to want to miss it. Now, layer something else on top of that. Recognition. Because here's another piece of science that doesn't get talked about nearly enough. There's a well-known model in occupational psychology called the effort-reward imbalance model. It shows that stress increases dramatically when effort is high, but reward is low. And reward doesn't just mean money. It includes recognition, respect, acknowledgement, and progress. And we can call it RRAP. It can be like a new little Hustle Rebels acronym for what we need in the workplace. RRAP, RRAP. Recognition, respect, acknowledgement, and progress is what we need in the workplace now. So when the effort is high, but those signals are missing, the brain interprets that imbalance as stress. There's even neuroscience research showing that social rejection or disregard activates the same brain regions involved in physical pain. So when someone's effort goes unseen, the nervous system registers that, not emotionally, biologically, physically, which means when effort is invisible, the brain only registers the cost of that effort, not the reward. Now here's where the science gets really interesting. And if you have an asshole of a boss that believes in collective punishment, which, honestly, a side note, I was today years old when I learned that punishment of a group for the wrongdoing of one was not called corporal punishment, it's called collective punishment. I'm actually interested if anyone else who grew up thinking that group punishment was called corporal punishment, you could holler at me so I don't hear from Nick if this is just one of those country bumpkin type of shits, but I digress. Feel free to take this info to your boss, because this isn't just a philosophical conversation about appreciation or acknowledgement. There's actually a large body of research showing that recognition plays a real role in how the brain processes effort and stress. And it actually connects back to something that we talked about earlier in the episode, the Reticular Activating System, or the RAS. So the RAS is the part of the brain, like I said, that constantly scans the environment and filters the information before it reaches your conscious awareness. It's essentially the brain's sorting system. So it's always asking the questions like, what matters here? What should I be paying attention to? What signals safety? And what signals threat? That system is running all day long in the background, processing more information than we're even aware of. And when we put effort into something, like work, relationships, responsibilities, the brain is constantly looking for signals that answer one simple question. Did that effort matter? Recognition becomes one of the signals the brain uses to answer that question. And when that signal shows up, something interesting happens neurologically. The brain releases dopamine. Dopamine is the neurotransmitter associated with reward and motivation. It reinforces behavior. It tells the brain, that effort was worth it. Do it again. Recognition can also trigger the release of oxytocin, which is the hormone associated with trust, connection, and social bonding. Oxytocin also tells the nervous system something different. It tells the brain, you belong here, which makes sense when you think about human evolution. For most of human history, survival depended on belonging to a group, to a tribe. Contribution had to be seen and valued. Recognition wasn't about ego, it was about belonging. Researchers Teresa Amabile, which I hope I said that right, and Stephen Kramer at Harvard studied thousands of employee workdays while researching motivation. What they discovered was that the single biggest driver of motivation wasn't money, it wasn't status, it was making meaningful progress that someone acknowledged. Even small recognition of effort significantly improved motivation and emotional well-being. And then there's neuroscience research on something called social pain. Researcher Naomi Eisenberger found that when people experience social rejection or disregard, the brain activates the same regions involved in physical pain, specifically the anterior cingulate cortex. In other words, when someone's effort is constantly ignored or dismissed, the brain doesn't interpret that as neutral. It interprets it as a threat to their belonging. And belonging is one of the most powerful regulators of the nervous system that we have. So when we talk about invisible effort, we're not just talking about hurt feelings. We're not just talking about safe spaces or being pussies. We're talking about a biological system that's trying to answer a very basic question. Did my effort matter to the group? And when that question goes unanswered for long enough, motivation drops, trust erodes, and burnout starts to build. This is literally biological, not to be twisted into some woo-woo feel-good shit. Because at the most primitive level, the human brain is still asking the same questions it asked thousands of years ago. Do I belong to this tribe, or am I on my own? Am I valued by the group, or am I expendable? Now, here's where this becomes really important for leadership. Because if you're in a leadership position, whether it's in a department, a company, or even just someone who people naturally look to for guidance, this matters more than you might even realize. Recognition isn't about ego. It's about regulation. When someone's effort is acknowledged, their nervous system receives a signal that the effort mattered. And when that signal is missing for long enough, the brain starts to interpret that the environment is unsafe. Same as that tribal tribe question that I mentioned earlier. Do I belong with this tribe or am I expendable? That's when motivation drops, trust erodes, and burnout starts to build. This is something that former Navy SEAL Jocko Willink talks about in his leadership training through EO Academy. He describes it as leadership capital. Leadership capital is built through small deposits over time. Checking in with your people, recognizing effort, asking how someone is doing, showing that you see the work they're putting in. Those things might seem small, but they're neurologically sending a very powerful message. I see you. Your effort matters here. And that message, that signal, changes everything. Because when people feel seen, their nervous system shifts out of threat mode and it starts to build trust. Engagement increases, and the workplace environment becomes psychologically safer. Again, not in a safe space kind of way, but in a true work with human psychology type of way. But when effort is invisible, when stress is invisible, and when leadership never acknowledges either, that's when invisible injuries start to accumulate. I actually had a moment recently that reminded me how powerful this truly can be. The first podcast interview I ever did, I was honestly really nervous going into it. The host asked me about my story, my time in the fire service, what led me to burnout, and how that eventually pushed me into the work that I'm doing now. So I talked about my experience at my last department because I've been on 2 different departments, not in a way to bash anyone, but just to be honest about that period of my life and what it looked like and what I learned from it. Now, if you've ever worked in a tight-knit world like the fire service, you know something. News travels. And there's always this fear that if you speak openly about your experience, somehow the firefighter world will collide with the rest of your life and you'll end up blacklisted for saying something you weren't supposed to say. So a couple of months after that episode came out, I got this random text message. It was from someone from the first department that I had been on. And at the time when I was on that department, he was just another firefighter who had definitely a few more years than I did on the job. But now he's a lieutenant. And the message said, I listened to your podcast interview. It was really good. And I'm sorry you had to go through that. I didn't realize how bad it was over there. Honestly, I was shocked. First of all, I couldn't believe he had even heard it. And second, I definitely did not expect that response. So we nostalgically chatted a little bit from when we had worked together, and then he had followed it up with something that had stuck with me along the lines of, yeah, we were a bunch of doofuses back then. We've all had a lot of growing up to do. Now, to be clear, I always had a great relationship with the guys in that department. I didn't leave because of them. But hearing someone who was now in leadership positions say that and acknowledge that people grow, cultures change, and sometimes we don't see what someone else is going through in that moment, that mattered. It was one of those moments where you suddenly feel seen. Not because someone fixed the past, but because someone acknowledged it. And honestly, that's the kind of moment that shows what real leadership looks like. Because leadership isn't about pretending mistakes never happened. It's about having the awareness and humility to say, we didn't always get it right, but we've grown. And when leaders do that, it sends a powerful signal to the people around them. It tells them, you matter, your experience mattered, and we're paying attention. And that's leadership capital. Not because he had to say that or reach out, but because he chose to. We both grew, learned, and we're both better for it. And what's interesting is that before that text ever came through, there was a part of me that had been stressing out about something in the back of my mind. Because when you share your story publicly, especially in a profession like the fire service, there is always that question sitting there. What happens if someone in your past hears it? Well, someone from my past did hear it. And instead of it turning into something negative, it actually became something else entirely. It became a moment of recognition, a moment where something that had been invisible was finally acknowledged. And in a strange way, that text message closed a loop in my own burnout story, even kind of like a healing moment. Not because it erased what happened, but because the nervous system finally got the signal it had been waiting for. That experience mattered. And moments like that are exactly what we've been talking about in this entire episode. Because when recognition finally shows up, it can resolve stress that the brain has been quietly carrying for years. But when it never shows up, that stress keeps getting pushed forward, which brings us back to burnout. When you combine everything we talked about, burnout starts to make more sense. Burnout often isn't about doing too much. It's about three things happening simultaneously. 1, effort is high. 2, processing is postponed. And 3, recognition is low. The perfect recipe for invisible effort and invisible injury, and no place for the nervous system to resolve either one. Next week, my guest Steve Bissone will go deeper into what he calls invisible injury, the psychological wear and tear that deserves the same respect as a physical injury. Like if someone broke their leg, we would expect them to take time off, have recovery, rehabilitation. But when the injury is psychological, we expect people to just keep pushing through, keep performing, keep functioning, and never acknowledge the cost. But as we just talked about, the brain doesn't forget those costs. It just delays them. And eventually, the bill comes due. And remember that word the brain keeps using throughout all of this? That word, later. Every time stress gets postponed, every time effort goes unseen, every time the brain says, not now, it quietly pushes another tab into that later pile. And eventually later stops being later. Eventually it becomes right now. So just zoom out for a second. Here's what we covered today, which honestly was a lot. Your brain is constantly scanning and filtering information through something called the Reticular Activating System, or the RAS. In high-pressure situations, the brain switches into operational mode, which allows you to function by postponing emotional processing, which it needs to do in order to accomplish daily tasks. But when that postponing keeps happening over and over and over, the stress doesn't disappear. It accumulates. And that accumulation is what neuroscientists call allostatic load, the wear and tear that builds up when the nervous system never gets the chance to resolve that stress. Then we layered something else on top of that, recognition. Because when effort is high but recognition is low, Research shows that the brain interprets that imbalance as stress, not emotionally, biologically. And that's where invisible effort and invisible injury start to intersect. The stress is real, the cost is real, even if no one else can see it. Because burnout isn't about weakness. Sometimes it's about carrying things that no one else can see. Invisible effort, invisible stress, invisible injuries, they all deserve attention. Because when the nervous system never gets the signal that the effort mattered and never gets the space to process the stress, eventually the brain stops asking how much longer and starts asking, why am I still doing this? And if you're at that point, it's time to start taking some action. If this episode resonated with you and you're starting to realize just how much of your stress might be living below the surface, I actually break this down much deeper in my Burn the Blueprint Masterclass. In that training, I know I had mentioned it before, but it's worth repeating again. I walk you guys through how high-achieving people end up running on autopilot for years, and how to challenge those beliefs and conditionings that might be limiting your potential, and how to actually rebuild an identity that isn't stuck in survival mode. If you're interested, you can find the link in the show notes. And if you want more conversations like this, make sure you're subscribed to the podcast. Next week's episode with Steve is going to build directly on this conversation about invisible injury and what it actually looks like in the real-world leadership and high-pressure professions, along with a lot of other great tidbits of conversation. And if you've been enjoying the show, one of the best ways that you can support is by leaving a review or sharing the episode with someone who might need to hear it. This podcast is completely independent, so every share, every review, or monetary support genuinely helps keep this conversation going. Thanks for listening, guys, and I will see you next week on Hustle Rebels.